In this video, we are going to start with the second way to insert data into a table, and that is by using a select statement. We have gone ahead and we've created our dbo.employee territories copy table. We do not currently have any data in the table. We essentially want to copy over the data from the dbo.employee territories into our copy table. And in order to do that, we're just going to use an insert into, and this is going to be the DBO employee territories copy. And we're just going to select everything from the DBO employee territories table. And that should populate all the data that we need for playing around with insert, update, and delete statements. Now, there's a little bit more involved if we were trying to use a query and not essentially selecting from a table and populating another table that was created based off of the same structure. And we'll get into that detail when we look at the insert statement, where we're just going to insert data into the table for each row. So let's go ahead and let's switch over to SQL Server Management Studio. We have our table out here. If I do a select against it, I should see that I don't have any data in the table currently. I want to go ahead and execute against my employee territories. That's where I have all the data. And in order to do that, I'm basically going to say insert into my dbo.employee territories copy. And in order to populate it, I'm using that query of the original table. Once I execute this, I should see that I have, if I change this to copy and execute this query here, I should see that I have 49 rows. So everything was copied over. Everything from the standpoint of our relationships between the employee table and the territory ID table should be in place, because we had our employee territories table that held all of those foreign key associations. So when we copy it over, since we have the same type of foreign key associations, we should be fine as far as inserting the data into the database. Going back to our PowerPoint, this is the first type of insert statement, and this is where we can go ahead and insert into the table, provide the column lists, and then give the values of the fields that we want to insert. Now, in this case, we have a few things to take into consideration, and we'll take a look at that when we look at a table that we want to insert into. Switching back to SQL Server Management Studio, now say that we have an instance where we want to add an employee territory. Let's just go ahead and pick an employee from the employee territories. And in this case, we have employee 1. Let's add a territory ID for employee 1. And in the first case, let's make sure that we add something that is not in the territory ID table. And I know, in fact, that 99999 is not in that table. So if we try to go ahead and do an insert into our dbo.employee territories copy, and we specify the field names, so this is going to be employee ID and then territory ID, we can put these in any order. It's just a matter when we do our values, it has to line up to the comma-separated list. So if we specify employee ID first, then when we do our values, we have to specify the employee value first. If we do the territories, then we have to do the territories first. And this is where we're going to do values. And we have an employee ID of 1 that we want to populate, and then that 99999, which we know is not in that territory ID table. Now, we should assume that this is going to fail. And it does, because it says that it has an issue with that foreign key constraint. Now imagine if we hadn't put the foreign keys in. That would have essentially inserted it into the employee territories copy if we were doing the select into to create that, because it wouldn't have that constraint to validate before it stores the data into the table. So that's one of the reasons why we like doing it using our DDL structure and then changing the names and running the table in and then doing the insert into from a select statement to get it populated. So that's one thing. Now, if I decide, and let's take a look at something a little bit more complex, and we have our employee. We have a number of fields that are not null, and when we insert something into the table, any field that is not null must have some type of value provided. If it happens to be an auto-incrementing field, then we can leave that out. But it's only when we have those capabilities on the field specified that we can know that we can leave it out of the query. But how do I know if a column is auto-increment? If I go and click on my table, I can go into design, and then this is going to give me the properties below, which I can kind of look through. And I'm on my employee ID, so it's giving me the property for that column. And as I scroll down, this is going to be the identity specification. If it says yes, and it says is identity, then I would leave the employee ID out of that statement when I'm trying to do an insert. I shouldn't be providing a value. The database is going to take care of adding a value to that, giving me the next available one based off of the identity increment and then the identity seed. So those values are going to determine how it's going to assign the values. Now, if I come back, we've talked about the employee ID. We have to provide the last name, the first name. The title is not required, so I could leave that out of my query. If I had it, I could provide it. If I don't have it, I don't need to provide it. I don't need to provide the title of courtesy because it's nullable. Don't need to provide the birth date, the hire date, the address, the city, the region, the postal code, the country, the home, phone, extension, the photo, the notes. I don't need to provide the reports to, and then I don't need to provide the photo path. Now, if I put in a reports to that's null, then it's essentially going to be the top dog. So we probably want to report to somebody. So we should probably at least put in the last name, the first name, and the reports to when we're inserting something for our employee table. So if I would go ahead, and before I do this, I don't want to save the changes. Now, by default, SQL Server Management Studio and Azure Data Studio will commit the changes automatically. So if I execute an insert, it's permanent. If I decide that I want to try it, and then based on the results of how things go, commit it or roll it back so I can try it again, I can start with a begin transaction. So when I start the begin transaction, after that, everything in my session will be in such a state that it's not committed to the database until I either specifically say roll back or commit. And in this case, I can go ahead and do an insert into my dbo.employees. I'm going to specify my last name, the first name, and reports to. I'm going to give values for my fields, and of course last name is a string, so I'm going to put in my last name of Kunkel, first name of Jennifer, and then reports to, I know that there is a 2 in the database, so I'm just going to specify 2, and at that point I can go ahead and execute the query. Now when I do that, if I run a select statement after, what I see is I have a row now in that table. There's a lot of fields that are null that do not have values, but the ones that I used to insert were something that I could actually go ahead and put data in. They were the required fields at a minimum, and then this one we went ahead and just added a value instead of putting in null because of the meaning of the null for that particular field. So let's go ahead and look at Azure Data Studio now, because we did this within a session. Our session is going to have the data until we either decide to roll back or commit. But if we go into the Azure Data Studio, we should not be able to see this because it should not be applied to the database yet. If we switch over to Azure Data Studio, if we execute a select from our dbo.employees, we are running in a different session. And when I look here, notice I don't have my information here. We have 9 records. If I go back, I have 10 records over here. So that's a little bit different. Now, if I go ahead and roll back my transaction, so I just go ahead and type in rollback and execute the rollback. Then if I try to do a select asterisk from employees, my record's not there. It's gone. If I go ahead and then re-execute this, begin the transaction, execute my insert statement, and this time commit the record, now every session should be able to see that record. So if I come back over here and rerun it, notice that I now have my record over here. So every session after I do that commit, we'll see the data. So that's one thing that as we go through and do a number of insert statements and then deletes and updates, we may want to begin a transaction, see how it goes, and then we can always roll back and retry or fix something if there was something that didn't quite go as expected. But that gives us the opportunity to unwind and retry our updates. Another thing, I'm going to switch back to the slide, is that if we have a number of updates that we want to do against one table, we can go ahead and use multiple values within a particular insert statement. We can provide the column list if necessary, and then we can go ahead and provide all the data that needs to be inserted. But that's just something to note. Now we want to circle back to Azure Data Studio because we want to be able to take a look at where that identity field might be defined. If we go into our table, if we select it and do a right click, we can go into the design mode. That's where we're going to find it. It's not going to be showing up here in the table grid. It's down below in the actual script. We will see the identity keyword with the increment and seed values right next to it. So this is going to tell us that this is an identity field. If we have an identity field, then we would leave it out of the query because we want the database to assign the value for us. If we go ahead and start trying to insert values there, it could get our identity sequence that it's using for assigning the values out of sync. So we want to let the database do that. But then we need to worry about Oracle. If we switch over to Oracle SQL Developer, before we get started with anything with inserting data into the table, let's look at our tools and preferences. This is going to give us an idea. If we go into our database option and the advanced, we have the auto commit. So by default, typically SQL Developer is set up to not auto commit the transactions. So this is more like you're using the begin transaction, and then you can choose to either commit or roll back. So we don't need to include the begin transaction if we have the auto commit set off. In my case here, I can go ahead and roll back at any point when I'm executing, and as long as I don't commit the data or leave the session and save the data without rolling it back, it's going to save all the data to the table. If I roll it back, then it's going to lose all the data. So that's one thing to note. So by default, it's set to auto commit off. Now, I want to go ahead and take a look at a couple different tables. And I'm going to go ahead and refresh my table view because I just created another table. If I close all my tables and then I go ahead and refresh, which is a Control R, I should see a new table pop up. And this new table, if I look at it, notice that it has this weird thing here for the data default. When I have something that's specified with a really strange looking thing in the data default, and it has something with the next file at the end and the data value here, that is essentially meaning that my column has been defined as an identity. And what it's doing underneath the hood is it's automatically generating a sequence for us that'll execute and insert the value into the table. Now, identity was introduced in Oracle 12c. That was around 2013. There are a lot of tables out there, and including our HR tables within our schema, that are not using identity columns. If we would go ahead and look at something like our department, notice I don't see any there. If I look at my departments, I don't see any there. If I look at my employees, I'm not seeing anything there. But if I go down to my sequences and expand it, I have a department sequence, I have an employee sequence, and I have a location sequence. So we need to kind of take a look at how we can insert data into a table when we're using a sequence versus in the messages table when that weird looking identity value is set up. Switching to the data tab, and we have a lot of different things in here. We'll just put in a test when we're doing this. Okay, so this is going to be first where we're going to insert into our messages table. This is where it uses an identity. So when we're doing this, we're just going to insert into messages, providing the fields. One is MSG ID, and then we have our message. But again, we said this was an identity field, so we don't want to use our message ID. So we're just inserting our message, and we can go ahead and do something like values. And this is going to be test message. Once I execute this, rows inserted, and then I can go ahead and select asterisk from messages and see that that is in the table. Now, if I want to go ahead and insert into the departments table, and we're just going to insert the next value, we have a department ID, we have the department name, the manager ID, and the location ID. If I go back to the columns, I have two that are nullable. So I have the manager ID and the location ID that are nullable, so I don't need to add any data. The only thing that I'm required to add is my department name, and because I don't have an auto increment on my department ID, I need to also provide that value. But how do I do that? So when I come over to insert into my departments table, I have to specify my department ID and my department name. For my values, though, I'm going to be using this sequence, and it's called departments_sequence. This is going to be what I use, and I'm going to essentially do a departments_seq.nextVal. So it's going to go out and get the next value from the database and insert it into that department ID. Then I can go ahead and put my name, and I'm just going to put test department, if I could spell. Now when I execute it, I have my row inserted, and I can select from my table that it's at the top, the 280 for test department, which is incrementing by 10 for that sequence. Now if I go ahead and I do a rollback, so this is similar to what we did before, and I execute that rollback, and then I look at my departments table and execute that. Notice I don't have my 280. If I look at my messages, I don't have anything there. So this is going to be essentially the way that we can inline do our insert, updates, and delete statements. And then if they're successful, we can commit. Otherwise, if there's a problem, we can roll back. And that's going to be processing as one unit of work. In the next video, we'll take a look at update statements.